While horror games have a rich history across computers and consoles stretching back decades, with some series like Resident Evil and Silent Hill reaching high levels of popularity, some titles wouldn't achieve that level of awareness in the public eye. One in particular has faded into obscurity, and it has a backstory that's just as interesting as the game itself. Involving a company that got its start adapting computer games from counterculture comics in a last-ditch attempt to ensure the survival of a literary magazine. A talented writer who had already adapted a mythological manga and would go on to pen multiple adventure titles in all sorts of genres. And a company that originated in educational software and branched out to making multiple games for computers and consoles with a literary feel. Together, all of these creators would unite to make an absolute classic for the PC98, and a remake that, while not as good as the original, still had a lot to offer, deepening the story in some aspects, while falling short atmospherically in others. This is the story of Ugetsu Kitan. It's 1984 in Saitama, and the Stratford Computer Center, a software development company spun off from a tutoring service that would also become known as Magical Zoo, is holding a contest in game design. The winner was a programmer named Jun Inoue, who later went by the name Jun Yamanaka. While winning the contest for his game Golden Idol, he began to make friends amongst the other competitors. One of the things that Jun Yamanaka and friends had in common was a love for Garo, a Japanese counterculture magazine that had started in the 1960s and had become emblematic of idiosyncratic content, as well as alternative manga called Gekiga. Spurred into doing their own thing because of the release of Golden Idol having multiple problems, like a truncated cassette version with an incomplete version of the game being released alongside the floppy version, Yamanaka and friends would form the company Zite, with Yamanaka himself as CEO. Zite would end up becoming successful, releasing multiple graphics editors for the PC98 throughout the 1980s, including the popular Z-Staff's Kid series. All through this, Yamanaka never forgot about Garo, and in the late 1980s, the magazine was in trouble, with the circulation and readership down. Yamanaka was already in the process of becoming involved with Seirindo, the publisher, and had an idea that would help the struggling magazine. He wanted to make computer games based on the stories in the manga. He'd also felt that the game industry at that time had gone away from an adult market, and regardless of how profitable anything they eventually created would be, he felt that this was an audience that needed products tailored to them. He would start out by adapting the most famous work from Garo, an experimental short manga by the artist Yoshiharu Suge, called Neji Shiki, or Screwtype. Written in 1968, this highly experimental short piece, telling the story of a young man desperately searching through a surreal landscape to stop his bleeding arm, had already achieved some notoriety, being cited and parodied in even Garo itself. But even though the prototype that was designed was getting positive response, Yamanaka would need help to develop this game. And in the interest of that, he'd establish a partnership with another studio who could make it a reality. With that, Will Company Limited was born. The developers at Will faced some problems with getting Neji Shiki off the ground. For one thing, the story is very short. Also, although extreme content was no stranger to the PC98 at this point, Neji Shiki still needed to be toned down a little bit for a slightly more commercial release. In order to solve these problems, it was decided to make Neji Shiki an adaptation of multiple stories by Yoshiharu Suge. The main character was changed to be an older writer, T, and in the game he goes through a surreal world of Suge's characters, all while wondering if he himself really exists, or is actually a dream. In Neji Shiki, we begin to see the atmosphere that would later show up in Ugetsu Kitan. The woodcut-style drawings, sense of despair, and horrific atmosphere are extremely unsettling. It's definitely still an adventure game at heart, driven by dialogue, but the overwhelming feeling of despair is prominent. And Neji Shiki ended up becoming a very uncommercial product. Despite all that, though, it ended up getting stellar reviews, with an absolutely glowing 3-page review going into the game's religious and psychological themes, being published in the October 1989 issue of OX1 magazine. Zite, and by extension Will, had put themselves on the map as a prominent developer with a skill at psychological works. But while Neji Shiki was abstract, future works would need a writer to guide the storytelling in a more cohesive way, and Will would find that in the writer Rioichi Emma, also known as Emma Rin. At the time, Rioichi Emma was working for a company called Zap, designing games for the Famicom. His most notable work was Ankoku Shinwa Yamato Takeru Densetsu, an adventure game derived from Japanese legends. This game has actually received a fan translation, and also has an anime adaptation that came out in the West under the title Dark Myth. It's a command list adventure game concerning the reincarnation of a Japanese warrior, and mixes traditional adventure game gameplay with occasional side-scrolling boss fights. While more simplistic than something like Neji Shiki, it did show Emma's skill at writing mythological elements into adventure games, and keeping a well-paced and coherent story mixed with fantastical elements. There would still be one final piece of the puzzle: the publisher. Despite the initial success of Neji Shiki, Zite's fortunes and dreams did not go as well as planned. After sales had helped boost the magazine, things started to go downhill again. And a second game based on other stories from Garo that attempted to be a mature exploration of more adult themes, with a title that I have to dance around saying because of YouTube regulations, but let's go with The Happiness of the Loins, did not achieve Neji Shiki's popularity. Due to this gamble being a failure, a third work was cancelled outright, and Will would move on to greener pastures. Those greener pastures would actually have connections to Emma Rin, and come from Emma Rin's parent company, Tokyo Shoseki. Tokyo Shoseki is an older company in Japan, most famous for textbooks. They'd already made some footholds in the console market, releasing a series of educational games similar to Math Blaster for the Famicom before branching out into entertainment with a separate division of their company that was now titled Tonkin House. Tonkin House worked on everything from sports games to ports of Western releases like Myst predecessor The Manhole and Origin Systems' robot tank game Omega. But Rioichi Emma would be a particular employee of note, working on planning and scenario design for Zite, an incredibly atmospheric and well-paced science fiction horror game that combined the visual aesthetic of the film Alien with story elements from the films and novels Solaris and 2001. From this, Emma Rin would get his own chance at game direction, and the results would combine everything we've looked at so far. The horror elements and design aesthetic of Neji Shiki, the psychological focus and writing skills of Rioichi Emma, and the budget of Tonkin House to give polish to the game. With all of these elements together, they would create a horror masterpiece for the PC98, the first version of Ugetsu Kitan. Ugetsu Kitan is actually a kind of literary adaptation that takes much of the same strategy as Neji Shiki did. It's inspired by, and adapted from, the novel Ugetsu Monogatari, or Tales of Moonlight and Rain. Ugetsu Monogatari, is a set of ghost stories adapted from both Japanese and Chinese legends, and has itself been adapted many times, most famously in a classic film directed by Kenji Mizoguchi. The game, Ugetsu Kitan, takes and adapts 3 of the stories from the novel, but it also creates a new framework of a surreal, violent, and disturbing underworld for the protagonist to traverse through and to link the stories together. While survival horror games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill move to shock and unsettle, in addition to being disturbing, and games like Onryo Senki create an unsettling slow burn to get under your skin, from about the very first moment, Ugetsu Kitan is an assault. After a prologue in which the protagonist gives a little girl a balloon and then follows her to a mysterious circus in a desert that has appeared outside of the city he was in, he is dropped into a creepy forest of shadows and violence, seeing lots of disturbing imagery and various yokai as he travels to get his bearings and tries to find the exit. He sees a man in a graveyard hanging from a tree, who gets up and leaves later on to have some drinks with the various yokai. He sees a store where terrible violence has occurred, and various creatures continue to interrupt his path as he navigates the forest. After stumbling around for a bit, he finds a mysteriously resurrected storekeeper who offers him a drink. Taking the drink, he passes out, and the first adaptation begins. The first adaptation is a giant puzzle of putting together the events of a story in sequence, and is an adaptation of the story The Chrysanthemum Pledge from Ugetsu Monogatari, as well as taking some plot elements from the Chinese story it was based from. In the version of the story from the book, the protagonists are warriors and it involves a chrysanthemum festival, but in the original story, A Meal of Chicken and Millet, A Friendship of Life and Death, the protagonist is a merchant, and it involves people gathering for a meal. The game takes elements from both. 3 people who had become friends as students and are now assembling for a meal, but one of them is late. Selecting characters and manipulating time through a menu, the player discovers that one of the men was a student that became a businessman, the other a student that became a poet, and that there was a love triangle between them and the third subject of the story, a young woman that worked in a local bar. The poet asked the woman out as a bet between the 2 men, but she rejected him, having feelings for the businessman. The businessman and the woman would later get married, and the trio, while all still friends and writing letters to each other occasionally, drifted apart. When meeting at a party years later, the businessman and poet make a bet to meet each other again in 10 years. But when that date comes, the businessman is delayed and misses his ship. Despite this, the poet and businessman's wife do meet up, only to find the businessman attending after all. They all sit down and talk through the night, but upon the end of the meal, as the businessman leaves, it's realized that he didn't touch his food at all. A representative from the businessman's company comes in and informs them all that the businessman had been killed overseas, and it's revealed that the actual attendee of the dinner was a ghost, honoring the promise despite his death in order to say goodbye to his wife and friend. It's actually a rather sweet story, and is the last moment of light that this game is going to give the player for quite a while. The protagonist regains consciousness in the store, and is able to get out behind it. He descends down a rope to another part of the forest, but yokai cut the rope behind him, and he is forced to continue forward. He finds himself in a strange village that advertises a photo studio, but he can't seem to find where that would be. Surreal events begin to pile up here, and wandering through a desert, he finds a pair of ghostly twins that point towards a skeleton in the ground. Taking the skeleton's belongings, a matchbox and bandage, he continues to wander the village, finding a painter in an underground tunnel who wants something from the photo studio, as well as a suddenly open tomb in another graveyard. Climbing into the tomb, he finds a soldier hiding from an air raid. Attempting to treat the man's wounds, he is given a picture, and it's the girl he gave the balloon to. While conversing about the girl, a firebombing starts up outside, and everything is plunged into darkness as we enter into the scariest part of the game. Buried in yet another tunnel, the protagonist lights one of his matches, only to come face to face with a man resembling himself and holding a book. He attempts to read the book, but the words are nonsensical and frighten him. The environment gets worse and worse, and the match burns out again. Lighting a second match, he comes face to face with a different version of himself again, and finds the book in his hands. He hands this other version of himself the book, before plunging again into darkness. It is impossible to state how utterly terrifying this section is, playing on fears of claustrophobia, identity, and darkness. But from it, we move to an image of a snowfall, and it's time for the second adaptation of the game. In this section, the player controls the scenario by watching an animation of a sky alternately thundering and clouding up, as a ghostly young girl plays with a ball, which falls from her hands and then rolls back to her, as a disturbing, slowed-down version of a folk song about hide-and-seek for children plays in the background. By clicking on different parts of the sequence, we can move between the past and the present. This is a much more direct adaptation of the story The Cauldron of Kibitsu. And once again, the player must reconstruct a series of events in the story by moving between times, clicking on various locations, learning more about the characters and circumstances of the story as the game progresses. We start out by watching someone nail protections against a building wall, and learn about a young man hiding inside. We won't know why he's hiding until close to the end of the story, but it flashes between this captivity and his earlier life as a carefree, alcoholic, womanizing gambler, put into an arranged marriage by his father in the hopes that he will change his ways. The protagonist of the story, Shotaro, ends up being a bad husband, spending most of his time with a prostitute, Sodami, while his wife Isora pines away. This gets so bad that his father locks him in a jail cell so he'll cease his carousing. But Shotaro's wife, conflicted about her feelings, lets Shotaro out, only for him to continue his affair with Sodemi and choose to run away with the prostitute to Kyoto. Consumed by rage and sadness, Isora falls ill. Her illness worsens, and she passes away despite the best efforts of her father-in-law to keep her alive. In Kyoto, Sodemi is also stricken by a mysterious disease and dies violently. And while mourning her and drowning his sorrows in a local bar, Shotaro follows another woman dressed similarly to both his wife and dead lover. It's his deceased wife, looking monstrous now, and contact with her makes him very sick for several weeks. Upon talking to a local onmyoji, a kind of historical figure that's a cross between a bureaucrat, clergy, and magician, the onmyoji chastises the protagonist for essentially bringing this all about through his own actions. He reveals that the only way for Shotaro to survive this is to hide in a house for 43 days, ignoring any pleas to go outside from his wife's ghost. He is able to last the 43 days, but makes a grave error on the final night, thinking that dawn had occurred, and instead walking out into the pitch-black darkness and into the arms of a very angry ghost. His friend hears horrible noises alongside the bell ringing outside of the building that he had nailed the protections to previously. And he runs to try to find the protagonist, only to find Shotaro's father, sword drawn, staring down at a pool of blood. Shotaro's father explains that whatever happened, he was way too late to stop it. When he got there was nothing left of Shotaro but the blood on the floor. He slashes at the blood and the screen, and our protagonist wakes up outside the village again. After questioning the townspeople and solving some more puzzles involving getting a sign to remove clouds from its design, and getting the moon to appear, the protagonist is able to finally get to the photo studio, where an attendant takes a picture of him using one of the most horrifying-looking cameras I've ever seen in a game. And the protagonist is actually able to use the resulting photograph to talk to the underground painter. Adding the photograph to the painting transports the protagonist to a tunnel of skulls. He travels through it to the third and final village of the game, and there's not as much there to this one. It's got a couple of beaches and a festival going on, and by talking to the sparse locals, the protagonist finds out that the young girl he saw is somehow the daughter of the chairman of this whole strange world. By watching several picture shows, a child's drawing of people without shadows, a story of an artist that became a yokai through consuming others, and a recursive one about watching the picture show itself, the protagonist is able to manipulate time, and can ask questions around 3 different versions of the village to people at different ages and stages of their lives. While doing all of this, and getting startled by the game's only oral jump scare, a sudden firework that occurs just as the festival is starting that just about sent me out of my chair. He finds that one of the people he's been asking questions of is a young girl, then student, then woman, who is without a shadow, caused by bullying and the death of her husband. The protagonist follows her as she walks along one of the rocky, decayed beaches in the town, only to come to a strange mansion. Upon entering the mansion, the protagonist is informed by the woman that the fireworks have set the lake on fire, and that the house will soon be engulfed as well. As an inferno erupts around the player, the picture of the girl burns away too, and the protagonist becomes overcome by the smoke and is unable to escape. He collapses, and it's time for the third, final, and longest adaptation in the game. The last story in the game is an adaptation of the tale The Reed-Choked House. But while the tale in the book is about a merchant who was away and how his wife was in his absence, the game goes in a different direction, borrowing a great deal of elements from the Mizoguchi film instead. It begins with an amnesiac waking up in a strange village, where an older man and his beautiful daughter have been nursing him back to health. After recovering, he takes on a role in the village as a merchant, going into town and selling goods. He has to follow the rules of the town, though. Never get back before dark. Falling in love with the man's daughter, he integrates himself in the village over time, eventually burning a box full of items from his past without looking at it, and marrying the man's daughter. One day, while peddling his wares, he buys a red comb for his wife, and she is uncharacteristically angry with him about it, telling him to get rid of it. After taking the comb with him, the protagonist's luck changes. No one buys his goods, and a monk comes by warning him about karma and mentioning that things are not as they seem. After not selling items well for several days, the protagonist of this story goes back home too early, only to find a ruined village. He finds out that he has been living in a village of spirits, and is so infuriated by this, and his own longing for his forgotten past, that he uses some charms given to him by the monk to exorcise the spirits and escape. While escaping, he runs into some bandits, but is able to avoid being killed by promising that he won't raise alarm to the next peddler that passes. He does so, but hears screams and turns back. Frightened by the assault on the peddler, he runs off into the distance, dropping the comb. Returning to his old village, he finds his wife and goes to sleep in his old house with his memory returned. This is where the story of the game and the story it is based on dovetail, as the protagonist wakes up to find that his own village was also destroyed, and the wife that he came back to, also dead a long time, simply being another phantom. Upon exiting the town, he is confronted by a former business partner with a striking resemblance to the peddler that was just attacked and possibly killed by the bandits. In a rage at being left to fend for himself, the former partner kills the protagonist, slashing at the player. Once again, and for the final time, the main protagonist of the game wakes up on the beach in the village. Heading back to the beach in the village, the player finally encounters the girl he saw at the beginning of the game. She thanks him for the balloon and bids that the protagonist follow her. Events get increasingly surreal, and the protagonist finds the girl on a building roof. In a shocking moment, she sends herself over the edge, and the protagonist blanks out, once again finding himself in another location, a weird mansion of identical doors. This is the final level of the game, and by interacting with a series of mirrors, waking a sleeping woman, and watching an ad for this strange environment on an old television, the player is finally able to come face to face with the chairman of this whole scenario and his daughter, and ask to be let out. After all of this, the protagonist is free to go, resuming his life in the city and taking with him what he saw as the credits roll. It's also hinted that this might partially have been in the protagonist's head, as images flash between the characters encountered all throughout the game and the ones seen on a Japanese street in the introduction. A small stinger after the credits reveals an even darker edge to this idea. With no one to draw experiences from, the inhabitants of the tent, including all of the yokai, have passed away, leaving only the young girl, standing in the now fully hellish environment in an absolute rage, ending the game on one final scare. Ugetsu Kitan artistically is a masterpiece, smothering the player in its terrifying world. Gameplay-wise, though, there are a couple of flaws that do hurt it. For one, there's quite a bit of pixel hunting involved, which can sometimes stump the player as to where to go next. Also, there are mazes, and some of them slow down the pacing tremendously, particularly in the final story. Finally, because the puzzles work on dream logic sometimes, occasionally it's very hard to figure out where to go next or how to trigger an event due to how nonsensical the world can be. However, the immaculate sound design and incredible graphics, only giving a player a break from the unrelenting atmosphere during some of the story adaptations, make it a hell of an experience, even if it's something that most people wouldn't necessarily repeat. The unrelenting bleakness of the main sections can make the game feel overwhelmingly oppressive to the point where the player might want to take a break and clear their head. Aside from the sweetness of the Chrysanthemum story, the headspace here for the entire runtime is one of death, decay, revenge, and suffering, and Ugetsu Kitan doesn't ever relent from that. It's an achievement, and the PC98 version is the best version of the story to play, text hooking in very well should you choose to go that route. In 1996, it would get a remake that, while not as good as the PC98 version, would make some interesting user comfort changes, reflect the style of games at the time, and add some new and surprising elements to the story. Well, Ugetsu Kitan's PlayStation port has a mysterious reputation on the internet a bit, with some sources claiming that it wasn't even released, and other circumstances like it appearing on some bootleg consoles without really any name or explanation as to what it is have increased its reputation. The actual origins of the game are fairly simple. This was a remake of the PC98 classic for consoles and ended up being quickly reissued as a budget re-release. Although sales data on it was scarce, so I can't determine whether it was out of it being a big hit, or it just didn't pick up and they wanted to make their money back. This game had some additions with a small amount of design and theme changes to make the game a bit more palatable for a casual audience, as well as some additional thematic points added in to differentiate it from its predecessor. It also got a licensed song at the end. First, the positives of the remake. The pixel hunting, which could get very difficult in the PC98 version, has now been completely eliminated from the game, making it much easier to play through. The player simply selects from icons representing the verb list at the bottom of the screen and can cycle through available options and hotspots with the D-pad. Additionally, some of the trickier puzzles and worst examples of pixel hunting, like finding a note stuck in the door in the house overgrown by reeds section that had me stuck for about a day and a half, have been eliminated. The music's also got some good tracks in it, although it loses some of the edge that the PC98 had, instead going for something a bit more atmospheric. Also, some of the dialogue has been massively extended, giving some better insight into the characters and themes, particularly in the adaptations. Finally, there's a new framing story opening and ending that gives a very different type of feel to the story. On the negative side, there are some changes that make this game not as engaging as the PC98 original. The beautiful artwork of the first game has been replaced by digital pictures of actors, and sometimes the artwork from the first game has simply been extracted, cut, and pasted onto photographic backgrounds, which never really looks quite right. This takes away from the power of the original sketches a bit. There's also a new interface using the D-pad for moving through the maze sections that has some unskippable short motion animations that look nice but get old after a while. Most interestingly, though, the backstory of the protagonist has been changed completely. From an audience insert average adult, giving a child a balloon, to a younger man, chronically ill and suicidal inside a hospital. Upon escaping his bed and running up to the roof, he sees a small girl who tells him not to end his life. And the protagonist finds himself in front of a slightly different version of the circus tent that was present in the original game. From here on out, there are some differences in how the plot progresses in the remake. For starters, the forest is now different, and the movement of the character will be broken up more frequently by encounters with various yokai, including some new ones, like a snake-headed woman that's another reference to the original work that the game is derived from. The puzzles in the first section progress in mostly the same way, except with some additional text-based hints prodding the player on where to go next. Upon more or less solving the same sequence of puzzles and getting into the store, the protagonist once again is drugged, but when he wakes up this time, he is now in a different starting story. This is another version of the Cauldron of Kibitsu, and it's been simplified a little bit for the player, with the shadow of the protagonist jumping between two locations between the past and the present, as well as some of the events being combined and simplified so that progression is more coherent. While it plays a lot easier and it's much easier to comprehend what to do next as well, I can't help but feel that the PlayStation port loses something here. The animation of the girl in the ball to the creepy rendition of the Japanese folk song was one of the creepiest images of the original game, and it sticks with you. In the PlayStation version, this jumping between two doors is much easier to use and comprehend, but the atmosphere just isn't the same. The writing, however, remains as strong as ever, with some additional bits of dialogue here and there, revealing the psychology of the husband and his addictive personality, the mental deterioration of his wife, the rage of his father, and a little bit more backstory on Sotomi. It's still a strong story, and remains a highlight of both games. Upon waking up in the store, the player proceeds in much the same way to the first village in the game. And honestly, I feel like the PlayStation port comes out stronger during this section in some ways. The village looks a bit less blasted out here, and it feels a bit more tonally equal to how the game is progressing, staying in a state of perpetual dusk, which works well with the mood of this section. The game, again, progresses pretty similarly, although the meeting yourself in the cave section has had the scares toned down tremendously due to there being a lot more light around during the sequence. When the light goes out in the bunker this time, the protagonist finds himself in the House of the Reed section. And this one is pretty much unchanged from the PC98 version, aside from some pixel hunt puzzles being eliminated and some mazes being shortened. Due to the change in visual style, it doesn't have quite the effectiveness of the PC98's version of the story. The sketches in the original just feel way more powerful than the photographs of locations here. But it's a solid adaptation of one of the strongest parts of the original. The second village is also almost identical to the one in the PC98 version, and actually extends the time manipulation puzzle slightly with a couple of additional requirements of talking to people, before the game can progress. When in the burning house, though, there's a couple of major changes to the plot. For one, you don't follow the shadowless woman through a decayed beach, instead walking along a somewhat better-looking one with water next to it. And when you pass out from the flames this time, you find yourself in another version of the Chrysanthemum's Promise story. This is, again, simplified a little bit, with fewer time incidents to pick out and puzzle through, as well as a chime sound that occurs once you do something that puts you on the right track. This is the most jarring stylistically of the sections, as is pretty clearly just a low-res cut and paste of the original PC98 assets on top of some stock photographs. The final sections actually proceed a little bit differently as well, with the girl not really talking about the protagonist or thanking him, and simply mentioning that she's the chairman's daughter. The final maze in the mansion is pretty much the same, but the mirror puzzle in the rooms is also simplified, going down from having to deal with 6 mirrors to just 2. But it's when that section is solved that we get to the climax and the biggest change in the game. This time around, the conversation with the chairman is much, much longer. He talks about how the events of the games are reflections of the past lives of the protagonist and his karma, and that he and his daughter are also working off their karmic debt by showing others similar experiences so that they may live more just lives. He reiterates the value of life despite suffering, and hopes that the next time that he and the protagonist meet, that they'll be meeting as friends. It's a positive, life-affirming message, but sadly the protagonist isn't hearing it at all, and it leads to a shocking new ending. Believing that his recent experiences prove the existence of the afterlife, and fearing that his current reality is yet another trap, the protagonist decides not to deal with the wheel of karma and go forward with ending his life. Unfortunately, though, one can't cheat the rules of the universe here, and he is severely punished for trying to game the system. Finding himself in a house full of pictures of the events of the game, he steps through one, only to find a mirror on the ground and the reveal that he has become a hideous monster himself. For his transgressions, he has become a yokai. The game then ends by breaking the fourth wall and showing a TV with a PlayStation attached to it, and a zombified hand reaches out for the power button, turning off the game. Social media posts indicate that this turns off the console as well on original hardware, but I wasn't able to replicate this effect, and honestly I'm doubtful that that's actually true, as once the graphics stop, a credits roll happens immediately over a Yuki Hata song that was specifically made for the game. While the new ending is certainly memorable, I actually don't like it all that much. It seems to run contradictory to the final message the chairman is espousing, and also puts a pretty clear disconnect between player and protagonist. It also ends up making the protagonist look rather foolish, like he didn't understand the message of the game. And moving towards something kind of darkly comic there trivializes his suffering, I think. The ending on a darkly comic note makes it feel like a random Tales from the Crypt episode, rather than the psychological, moody piece that the PC98 game was. And that doesn't really gel with the themes of death, rebirth, revenge, and promises that the rest of both versions of the game excel in. The creators of Ugetsu Kitan would end up moving on to other things. The vast majority of the Tonkin House staff that worked on it were eventually scooped up by Nintendo, and ended up working on, of all things, multiple iterations of the Mario Party franchise. Zite would eventually go under in the late 1980s, and despite Jun Yamanaka's efforts, he could never establish a good level of trust with the authors of Garo. That, combined with Garo's low readership, and a failed attempt to make the magazine digital to bring in more audience, would cause the magazine to end in the late 90s as well. Will Company Limited, however, still exists, working in more indirect development roles since about 2001 or so, up to the current generation. Interestingly, despite Ugetsu Kitan's obscurity, Akihata's licensed song for it got a re-release in 2021, with a new music video and marketing push. Ugetsu Kitan was an amazing accomplishment for the time, and honestly I'd recommend the PC98 version over the budget remake, pixel hunting and mazes notwithstanding. Its arty nature and unique circumstance as a kind of spiritual successor to Neji Shiki gives it a hell of an identity. And it's still incredibly disturbing to this day. The PlayStation version is more light and accessible, and it's certainly an easier playthrough if that's what you were going for, solving a lot of the trickier issues in the original release. But it loses a little something in the translation, with the themes getting a little bit more muddled. Still, it remains a notable entry in Japanese horror, and both games are massively overlooked given the quality of the writing. Overshadowed even in games by their own creators, it remains a hidden gem on both systems that took elements of counterculture, literature, and horror to make something very special. See you next time. Thanks especially to this channel's patrons, with an extra special thanks to James B. and Andro. Highest tier subscribers to the Patreon this month will get a reading of the stories from Ugetsu Monogatari that this game is based from, as well as some brief discussion of some of the yokai in the game. All of the engagement, input, passion, and arguments and kind words in the comments are immensely appreciated. You have no idea how much, and I look forward to continuing making these videos for the foreseeable future. Happy Halloween.